Ever since the very first newspaper rolled off the press, its authority has been its single greatest asset. But that same authority, well, it's always created this really tempting opportunity for deception. So let's dive into the fascinating and sometimes pretty dangerous history of the media hoax.
It really all boils down to this one question, doesn't it? We're all told not to believe everything we read. But haven't you felt it? That little bit of extra weight a printed word or, a digital headline carries, it just feels more solid than a rumor, way more respectable than gossip. So let's take a look at how that trust has been exploited over the years.
And it all starts with something really simple: the filler story. For centuries, the power of the press was so massive that even the most absurd little tales, sometimes just used to fill up some empty space on a page, could be accepted as the absolute truth. And what you're seeing here are actual hoaxes from the early 20th century. A rural correspondent out in Connecticut just made them up. We're talking about a patriotic chicken laying red, white, and blue eggs, a cow that swallowed a watch that kept on ticking, and get this, a man who painted a spider on his bald head just to scare away flies. And yep, they were all printed without anyone batting an eye. Why? Well, because they were entertaining, they were unusual, and most importantly, they were in print. This right here is the core concept that makes it all possible: the authority of print. Think about it. Media outlets report on huge public issues that are way beyond our own personal experience. We have no way to check it for ourselves, so we're kind of psychologically primed to just trust the source. And that little gap in credibility, that's the hoaxer's playground. But these hoaxes aren't all fun and games, not by a long shot. You can really divide them into two main categories. The first, and honestly the most serious, is when media insiders pull off deceptions for political gain. And there is no better example of this than the newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst. So let's set the scene. It's the late 1890s, and the nationalist revolt in Cuba against Spanish rule is actually starting to die down. But William Randolph Hearst, he sees a golden opportunity to sell more papers. He basically tells his journalists to print these sensational, often totally made-up stories about Spanish atrocities to whip up war fever back in America. And this is a perfect example of his technique. A totally minor customs inspection gets twisted into this sordid tale of national dishonor. Hearst's papers splash this story all over the front page, and they conveniently forgot to mention that the search was done privately by a female matron, not by a bunch of leering Spanish policemen. The public outrage was immediate, and it was huge. This infamous quote, wow, it just says it all. When his illustrator, a guy named Frederick Remington, cabled from Cuba saying, "Hey, there's no fighting here for me to sketch," Hearst shot this message right back: "You furnish the pictures, and I will furnish the war." I mean, that is just a chilling level of cynicism, and it shows his direct role in using his media empire to literally start a war. But it wasn't just the big media insiders who were pulling the strings. The second category of hoaxes is when outsiders figure out how to manipulate the press, and they do it for publicity, for money, or, just for the fun of it. Okay, so meet Harry Reichenbach. He was an absolute master of the publicity stunt. He got hired to sell 2,000 prints of this painting, September Morn, which nobody wanted. So what was his solution? He put a print in a shop window, paid some street kids to stand outside gawking at it, and then he called up Anthony Comstock, the city's most famous anti-vice crusader, to report an indecent picture corrupting the youth. The result was pure genius. Comstock tries to get the painting removed, the whole thing goes to court, and suddenly every single newspaper in New York is running the story, and they're including a picture of the indecent painting itself. An obscure piece of art became a national sensation, selling over 7 million copies. Reichenbach didn't just sell a painting, he sold a controversy. And then sometimes the motivation is just to have a good laugh. You had a stockbroker who invented an entire college football team and would just call in fake game results to major newspapers who printed them without question. In another case, a professor got so annoyed by how pompous the Who's Who in America directory was that he submitted a totally fabricated entry for a fake scholar. And of course, they published it. But what happens when a hoax, once it gets into print, just refuses to die? Even after it's been exposed, a really good story can be so compelling that it just takes on a life of its own and eventually becomes accepted as history. The classic example here is H.L. Menchen's History of the Bathtub. Just to entertain himself during World War I, he wrote a newspaper column that was just chock full of fake facts, like President Millard Fillmore installing the first bathtub in the White House, or Boston making bathing illegal unless a doctor told you to. And check out this timeline. It shows the incredible staying power of a lie once it's in print. Mencken himself came clean 9 years later and said it was a total fabrication, but it was too late. The story was already in the newspaper archives. Decades later, it was still being referenced as fact by everyone from college professors to President Truman. The lie had literally become more durable than the truth. Even Mencken himself was shocked. He described his own article using these words, just completely amazed that people had taken his obvious spoofing so seriously. But he had totally underestimated the authority of print. Once an idea gets into the system, it is incredibly hard to get it back out. So, all of this leads us to a bit of a modern thought experiment. Given how fast our media moves today, what would be the ultimate high-stakes hoax? The author of our source material actually posed this very same question, and the answer they came up with wasn't about politics or war, it was about something that moves even faster: money. Imagine a fake, but very official-looking news alert that a major government is about to devalue its currency. In our age of algorithmic trading, computers would react instantly, selling off that currency in milliseconds. A real financial panic would kick off, and by the time any official denial could be issued, even just a few minutes later, the damage would already be done. The lie would become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that really brings us to our final thought. From silly little filler stories to warmongering and financial chaos, the principle is exactly the same. The credibility of our information systems can always be turned against us. So the real question for us today is, in an age where information moves way faster than the truth, how do we spot the difference?